Before dawn on April 1st, 1970, more than 400 North Vietnamese soldiers rose out of the darkness and charged straight into a small American firebase 5 miles from the Cambodian border. The base had no perimeter fence. Its ammunition was stacked in the open, in plain view of the jungle. Fewer than 200 Americans held it. For the next 3 hours, the fighting was so close that men clubbed each other with jammed rifles. An entire stockpile of artillery shells exploded inside the wire and threw soldiers from both sides off their feet. By 5 in the morning, the attack was broken, and the ground around fire support base Illingworth held dozens of North Vietnamese dead. The Americans took terrible losses that night, but the men who attacked them paid a far heavier price, and they paid it because of something the firebase had been built to do all along. This is what happened at Illingworth. Tay Ninh province sits in the southwest corner of South Vietnam, with the Cambodian border running along its edge. Behind that border were the sanctuaries, the base camps and supply dumps where North Vietnamese units rested and refitted, safe from American ground troops who were not allowed to cross. From those sanctuaries, men and weapons flowed east towards Saigon, along trails the Americans spent the whole war trying to cut. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In the spring of 1970, the 1st Cavalry Division was running a new kind of operation in that border country. Brigadier General George Casey, the assistant division commander, wanted to draw the North Vietnamese out of hiding and force them to fight in the open, where American firepower could destroy them. The method was simple and cold. Push small firebases out close to the border, dangle them in front of the enemy, and wait for the enemy to take the bait. Fire Support Base Illingworth was one of those lures. It had been set up in March 1970, about 35 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh City and roughly 5 kilometers from Cambodia. It was named for Corporal John Illingworth of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, killed 2 weeks earlier near Tay Ninh. The men who garrisoned it understood exactly what they were. Ralph Jones, an artilleryman with one of the batteries on the base, put it plainly years later. They were dangling out there like a piece of bait with no protection, and the worst part of being bait was that they were not allowed to dig in the way they wanted to. Jones and his crew served the big guns at Illingworth, 2 self-propelled 8-inch howitzers, and they had been moved onto the base along with several tons of their ammunition. From the first day, the gunners wanted to dig pits and get those shells underground, out of sight and shielded from a blast. They were ordered not to. Higher headquarters told them not to waste time digging, so the ammunition stayed stacked on the surface, on the face of the hill, where anyone watching from the jungle line could see exactly where it was. That decision would nearly destroy the base. Illingworth had other problems. There was no real perimeter fence. The defensive berm was incomplete in places. The base sat in flat, open country with the tree line not far off, and the garrison was a patchwork. 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, C Company and E Company, held the perimeter, and one of those companies had been in a hard fight only days before and had taken in green replacements on March 31st. 4 artillery batteries shared the inside of the wire. Counting everyone, fewer than 200 men were there to hold it. The commander on the ground was Lieutenant Colonel Michael Conrad. He knew his base was exposed. He knew it was meant to attract an attack. 3 days earlier, a nearly identical North Vietnamese assault had hit another firebase called J, only a few miles away. Conrad walked his perimeter that last evening, checked his positions and put his men on full alert. Then he tried to grab a few minutes of sleep in the command bunker. The bait had worked. Out in the dark, a North Vietnamese force was already moving into position. The 272nd Regiment, one of the most experienced and most heavily bloodied formations the enemy had in the south, the same regiment that had been thrown at American firebases again and again over the years and torn apart each time, was getting ready to do it one more time. At 2:18 in the morning on April 1st, the firebase came apart under fire. The North Vietnamese opened with a barrage of more than 300 rounds. Mortars, rockets, and recoilless rifle fire poured onto Illingworth for 20 solid minutes. It was not random harassment, it was aimed. The fire direction center of one artillery battalion took a direct hit that killed 3 radio men sleeping nearby. Another battalion's fire direction center was hit several times, killing 7 men. Inside the first minute, the base lost a chunk of the people whose job was to coordinate its own artillery. Then the ground assault came. More than 400 North Vietnamese soldiers rose up out of the dark and charged across the open ground toward the berm, hitting the perimeter from multiple directions at once. They came fast and they came close, closer than anyone could use artillery against without killing their own men. The fight turned into the kind of combat that almost never happens in the modern age. Men fired into shapes a few feet away. The North Vietnamese got onto the berm in places, and the Americans fought them off the lip of it by hand. The dust thrown up by the bombardment hung so thick in the air that it fouled the weapons. M60 machine guns jammed. M16 rifles jammed. Soldiers who could not clear their weapons in time swung them like clubs, fighting hand to hand in the dark with rifle butts and entrenching tools and anything they could reach. The artillerymen could not stay on their guns. The enemy was inside the range where the big shells were useless and the danger to friendly troops was total. So the gunners climbed down off their tracked vehicles, picked up rifles and joined the infantry on the line as riflemen. The men who had come to Illingworth to fire 8-inch howitzers ended the night fighting as infantry in the dirt. One of the defenders was Sergeant Peter Lemon, a young soldier with E Company. When the assault hit his sector, Lemon fought off wave after wave with a machine gun, then a rifle, then hand grenades, fighting on even after he was wounded more than once. At one point he carried a more badly wounded man to the aid station, then went back to the fight. For what he did that night, holding his piece of the perimeter when it was nearly overrun, Lemon would receive the Medal of Honor. He was the only living recipient from the entire battle. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Around 3 in the morning, the recon platoon launched a counterattack and drove the North Vietnamese back off a stretch of the berm they had taken. The line was bending in places, but it had not broken. Then came the thing the gunners had warned about from the first day. A North Vietnamese sapper got a satchel charge close to the stacked artillery ammunition near the howitzer position in the center of the base. Fires started spreading toward the shells. And at 3:18 in the morning, roughly an hour into the battle, around 190 rounds of that exposed ammunition went off at once. Survivors described it as a titanic roar. Everyone on the base on both sides was lifted off the ground by the blast. It tore through a section of the berm and sprayed the whole compound with shrapnel and burning debris. It left a crater 20 feet deep in the middle of the firebase. The explosion was so violent that it stunned everyone. For 5 to 10 minutes, the shooting simply stopped. Americans and North Vietnamese alike too rattled and too deafened to keep fighting. The same blast that nearly gutted the base also broke the back of the assault. In that lull, while both sides reeled, the men of C Company moved forward and filled the gap that had been blown in the northern perimeter. By the time the dust settled and the North Vietnamese tried to come on again, the hole in the line had been plugged. Through the whole battle, help was coming from above. A Cobra gunship pilot, Captain Joe Hogg, circled over the firebase, and at one point his aircraft was the only working link Illingworth had with the outside world, relaying communications during the worst of it. Gunships and tactical aircraft worked the tree lines around the base. American artillery from other firebases fired in support, more than 3,000 rounds over the course of the night. After the explosion, the North Vietnamese had had enough. The assault that had nearly overrun the base lost its momentum and fell apart. By around 5 in the morning, less than 3 hours after the first rounds landed, the ground attack was over. The enemy pulled back toward the border, carrying what wounded they could and leaving their dead in the open ground around the wire. When the sun came up over Illingworth, the cost was laid out plainly. 24 Americans were killed, 10 of them from the artillery units. Another 54 were wounded. For a garrison of fewer than 200 men, that worked out to roughly a 40% casualty rate, one of the highest of any firebase fight in the war. Some of the replacements who had arrived only on March 31st were dead by 4 the next morning, killed in their first night in combat. Out in the grass and along the tree line, burial details counted the North Vietnamese dead. The numbers in the records run from about 74 to 88 confirmed, with more certainly carried off, against an attacking force of more than 400. The 272nd Regiment had been mauled yet again, thrown against an American firebase and broken against it, exactly as it had been broken at Soi Tre and at Crook and at Burt before. That morning the division commander, Major General L.V. Roberts, flew in by helicopter. He pinned a silver star on one of the defenders and promised the survivors a hot meal. Then he told them something they did not want to hear. They would have to hold Illingworth for one more night. The men dug in again and waited. The enemy never came back. On April 2nd, the Americans abandoned the firebase and pulled out. The victory at Illingworth was real, and it was anything but clean. This was not a firebase that killed hundreds of attackers while losing a handful of its own. The men who held it paid in blood, more than a quarter of them killed or wounded in a single night, and they paid partly because of a decision made above their heads. The order not to dig the ammunition in turned the base's own shells into a bomb in its center, one that wounded the defenders as badly as it stunned the attackers. Ralph Jones and the other gunners had seen it coming from the first day. They had been overruled. There is a hard logic underneath the whole story that the survivors never stopped wrestling with. Illingworth was bait. It was put out in the open on purpose, undermanned and exposed, to draw the North Vietnamese into a fight where American firepower could destroy them. The plan worked. The 272nd Regiment took the bait and was shattered. But the men who served as the lure were the ones who fought hand-to-hand in the dust, who watched green replacements die on their first night, who were lifted off the ground by their own exploding ammunition. The strategy counted them as a price worth paying. Many of them have spent the rest of their lives knowing it. On the morning of April 1st, 1970, a North Vietnamese regiment looked at a small, half-built firebase with no fence and its ammunition stacked in the open and saw an easy kill. They were right that it was exposed. They were wrong about whether the men inside would break. It cost them most of an attacking force to learn the difference. On a patch of ground the Americans walked away from the very next day. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Thing but clean. This was not a firebase that killed hundreds of attackers while losing a handful of its own. The men who held it paid in blood, more than a quarter of them killed or wounded in a single night, and they paid partly because of a decision made above their heads. The order not to dig the ammunition in turned the base's own shells into a bomb in its center, one that wounded the defenders as badly as it stunned the attackers. Ralph Jones and the other gunners had seen it coming from the first day. They had been overruled. There is a hard logic underneath the whole story that the survivors never stopped wrestling with. Illingworth was bait. It was put out in the open on purpose, undermanned and exposed, to draw the North Vietnamese into a fight where American firepower could destroy them. The plan worked. The 272nd Regiment took the bait and was shattered. But the men who served as the lure were the ones who fought hand-to-hand in the dust, who watched green replacements die on their first night, who were lifted off the ground by their own exploding ammunition. The strategy counted them as a price worth paying. Many of them have spent the rest of their lives knowing it. On the morning of April 1st, 1970, a North Vietnamese regiment looked at a small, half-built firebase with no fence and its ammunition stacked in the open and saw an easy kill. They were right that it was exposed. They were wrong about whether the men inside would break. It cost them most of an attacking force to learn the difference. On a patch of ground the Americans walked away from the very next day. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.